Sammy Hogue, who has volunteered very graciously to become our new monthly program coordinator. So, Sammy, take it away.
You. We're delighted to have Ashley Martens speak to us at our November meeting. Ashley is a native of Wyoming, but she spent many years living in Idaho, Montana, and Washington. She currently lives in Bozeman, Montana with her husband and her 2 adult children and 2 dogs. Ashley has a baccalaureate degree in biology and a master's degree in environmental science. She has done field work such as surveying woodpeckers in Idaho, and she worked for the reintroduction of the mountain quail in eastern Washington. Ashley's a naturalist and environmental educator, and she brings the practice of mindful observation into her teaching and her guiding. Ashley serves now as the Intermountain West Regional Manager of the Old Growth Forest Network. And so welcome, Ashley.
Right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So let me pull up my slide and replace yours. All right.
Excellent.
How's that looking?
Excellent.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, I'm Ashley Martens, and I wish I could see your faces, but the way this is outlined, I can't. So I'm just going to imagine all of these wonderful birders. I'm a birder myself, and know that birders tend to be the best kind of people. So I'm glad you're here tonight. I was invited to speak about old growth forests and birds that have relationships with them, and in relationship to the Old Growth Forest Network, which is an organization that I work for now. So without further ado, here's a little bit about me, just because it's important to have a personal connection. The picture on the left is me guiding a birding trip. I think we were all looking for a little McGillivray's warbler tucked up against a trunk of a Douglas fir tree on that trip. That's me and my family in the center at one of my favorite larger trees in Montana. Our trees don't grow nearly as big as yours do in Washington, at least not around Bozeman. And then that picture on the far side is me actually standing inside of one of the very big trees that does grow in Montana. That is in the northwest corner, where we have a coastal disjunct inland rainforest like you have in Western Washington. So I do have one, I guess I have two claim to fames with Washington, but this feels like especially my claim to fame. And I am wondering if any of you have any idea either where I am or what bird I'm holding, or both. And I want to try interacting with you all. So if you could type in the chat if you have any ideas. See if that works. And I just pulled up a box, so you might see a gray box. Does anybody have any guesses? Thank you. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Nice. Okay, does anybody have any guesses of where I am? I am in the state of Washington, and my outfit, the patches on my outfit might give you a little bit of a clue.
While you're thinking about that, we have one Clark's nutcracker, 2 Lewis's woodpeckers, and 1 shrike.
All
yes,
right.
Eastern Washington, yes.
All right. I guess I won't make you guess anymore. So this was a stint where I worked. Yes, thank you, Chaz. All right, Chaz is the winner. So I was a volunteer caretaker on Protection Island National Wildlife Refuge with my husband when we were in our 20s, and that is a pigeon guillemot that I am holding. They nest on the bluffs on Protection Island. It's at the mouth of Discovery Bay off the coast of Sequim, Washington, and the largest glaucous wing gull colonies in the Puget Sound region nest there. So I'm sure some of you have been to Protection Island, and it was a really, really special part of my life. So that's my claim to fame. But I also worked on mountain quail, eastern Washington, around Stoughton, which is near Lewiston. So maybe some connection there with where you'll have your next annual meeting. So unfortunately, this picture of our founder, Joan Maloof, just didn't pop in here. But speak a bit about founder, and she used to be a forestry and researcher, and when she discovered most people don't ever see old growth forests, and this might seem shocking to you all living in Washington, but think about the Northeast where there's less than 1% left. Then she decided she wanted to start a national organization to sort of create a structure, a repository, and help elevate protections for at least one forest per forested county in the country. And my job is to do that in the Intermountain West. So the biggest and most complicated question is how to define an old growth forest. So researchers, naturalists, scientists, foresters have been trying to define this for as long as they have come up with the idea that there are successional stages of forests. So I just want you to put yourself in this forest for a few moments and consider what the air might feel like. What is its temperature? Is it moist or dry? How big or small do you feel when you're in this forest? Are there any sounds that you're hearing? Maybe the sound of gentle breeze in the trees, maybe some kind of birds or other animals. And of course, you see all of these things that are more classic Western Washington old growth forest features. But Washington is a diverse state, and so there are different forest communities that present themselves as old growth in different ways. So when I look at this picture, I wonder if you could do the same and just sort of picture yourself there, place yourself there for a moment. You might notice the sweet smell of pine. Notice the temperature of the air, whether it's moist or dry. Imagine what sounds you might hear. And note that these two forests look quite different in some ways, but are also quite similar in other ways. And so scientists have pretty much agreed that there will never be a final definition for old growth that captures the complexity that it takes for an old growth forest to become what it is. But we can look at particular features. So your state, like I said, is diverse, and everything shaded green is forested in some way. So Washington has a huge amount of forest, and is fortunate enough to have a lot of public land as well. And so when we talk about those really low statistics of old growth forests remaining, I know that you see a lot lost there, but there's a greater chance, especially since you're all birders and you like to be outside, that you have experienced an old growth forest at some point in your life because of where you live. But not everyone has that opportunity. So we're quite lucky out west. So some of the attempts to define old growth are in terms of forest succession. So this is an example in Western Oregon, and they talk about seral stages, foresters, early, mid, and late seral. So there's this succession after disturbance where different plant communities come in, the canopy gets tighter, it's a shadier forest, bigger trees sort of take over, some die, and then there become lots of woody debris or standing dead trees like snags. And in this timeline, it's from 0 to 500 plus years. So time is a key ingredient. We can all agree upon that. And then in the West Side, sometimes we have more ecological definitions of old growth in relationship to the productivity of these forests because they were traditionally harvested, but also because of species of concern like the spotted owl. So they start to become mapped based on their structure and what kind of either management use they support or species that they may support. And then finally, on the east side, these dry ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, like that second old growth forest picture that I showed you, forests succession looks a little bit more like this timeline, where there's lots more openings, not nearly as much vertical structure or complexity, but would still be considered old growth. And then we could look at things like juniper woodlands, which can also take their own form and express themselves in different ways with time as the main ingredient. So we created our organization two visuals for moist and dry old growth forests and features that help to define them. Because most people tend to think that an old forest is big trees. And that is definitely one piece, depending on the species and the elevation and the temperature, but it's not the only one. And so my hope is by the end of this talk this evening that not only will we highlight birds that depend on some of these old growth forest features, but that you all will also be able to recognize more of these old growth forest features in your adventures. So the first one I want to talk about is craggy bark on old oops, I went back. Forgot that my thing has an arrow. Craggy bark on old trees. So the chat thing didn't work so well before, so I'll skip that and just let you, instead of putting it in the chat, just give you a moment to bring to mind what kind of birds, when you think about a moist old forest, might depend on craggy, thick, furrowed bark on old trees. So just take a moment. Bring back to mind birds that you might have seen hitching on those trees or feeding or maybe even nesting. And some of the birds that might have come to mind are this assemblage of birds. And I want to focus specifically on this one, the brown creeper. So even though you might be thinking, well, wait, sometimes I see brown creepers in other, forest types, or maybe even in town if there's, large trees near where you live. But the research shows that because creepers love to eat insects and especially spiders, and those are in high abundance in large diameter trees with deep furrows on their bark, that takes time. In a place like Western Washington, it might take 80 to 100 years, but in a place like where I live in Montana, that might take 200 years in order to develop that sort of thick, craggy, furrowed bark that you find on old trees. And there was a research study that showed that it was more efficient for a brown creeper to feed on one large old growth tree than it was to feed on 3 medium-sized trees or 13 of a smaller diameter of trees. So if you think about efficiency in terms of energy use, then these creepers can save energy by sticking to one big tree. And there are studies that associated them more often feeding on Douglas fir trees in the Cascades greater than 100 centimeters DBH. So let's see how our first video will go. So this video, pardon the words at the beginning, but I'll speed through it. But this was in British Columbia. And so not only do brown creepers feed on these trees with thick bark, but they also nest where the bark is flaking up. So I actually have a story about this. I was teaching children in Moscow, Idaho, on Moscow Mountain, forest. We were some kind of nature-based class. I don't know exactly what the theme was, but not letting me go. But we were deciding to build something out of bark and things on the tree, and I was teaching them how to identify different trees based on needles, bark, things like that. And we went to grab a piece of bark and pull it off of a tree. And before I actually ripped that piece of bark off of the tree, a little brown creeper came squealing, screeching out from behind this little flap of bark. And it turned out I almost ripped off the bark that was holding this hammock-shaped little nest that the brown creepers build in these trees. So careful when you're collecting bark, I guess is the story, but it was a really cool thing to be able to watch and show these children. Because I was going to ask you to think of birds that use horizontal branching and elevated mosses and lichens. So this is one of your beloved endangered birds in Western Washington, the marbled murrelet. And then there's a tinier bird that also loves to use lichens that we don't want to forget about, our little hummingbird species. So marbled murrelets, of course, are of a concern. So before I play this video, I'll see if I can let the bandwidth work itself out. But the ecology of marbled murrelets, as you may well know, makes them extra vulnerable. They are extremely rare in that they are rather solitary. They don't group up like other birds in their family. And they spend their life both at sea and then during the breeding season on land. So flying from forest to sea and back again. And they only lay one egg, and they lay on this mossy covered platform. They don't really even build much of a nest, kind of a scrape where there's mosses elevated, and it has a pointy end so that it doesn't roll off. And that one egg per year is that chance that year. So if something happens to egg, then renesting attempts are usually not very successful. And because of the loss of old growth trees that develop these large branches that take time to create platforms big enough for this bird to create a platform nest upon and balance one egg upon, then those trees, if they're cut down, right, it takes a long time for them to grow again, but also they need gaps in these canopies that are created by natural disturbances as opposed to large-scale disturbances. So here's a picture of a marbled murrelet's first flight, and I want to choose this because it really sort of exemplifies the vulnerability of this one chick, this one chance. So there's
1 year
this
after
is a
wildfires swept through
resilient bird. I'm just going to go
coming
forward so
back.
that we can
Many
get to
of the Doug firs
the part
that
of the
they used to nest
video.
in as well.
Paper reporters were all out here. The Audubon Society had actually offered a monetary reward for the first person to find a marbled murrelet nest because it had gone so long undiscovered that there's a lot of interest on this nest when it was finally found.
At the end of the day, a parent brings in one last fish for the chick and leaves quickly. In fading twilight, the chick preens itself. It's hard to see what's happening, but then, without any hesitation, it flies off the nest. That was a remarkable moment. Let's watch it again. Nobody knows how a young murrelet finds its way through the forest to the ocean. Once the bird crosses the surf line, it's ready to start its life as a seabird. Marbled murrelets are rare on the Monterey Bay. Yet if you look hard,
So you saw that little bird take flight, right? It's no longer cared for by its parent. It finds its way to the ocean, hopefully, right? But first, that one chick has to get big enough to grow all of those feathers to be able to fly and then be able to swim and be able to feed itself. So as you saw, there are gaps that are needed in the canopy, both for the parents to fly in and to fly out, to navigate in and out of. And those naturally form in an old growth forest when left over time for trees to die and fall, for natural gaps in the canopy to keep that old growth forest system going. But one of the challenges with the non-natural gaps and human encroachment on marbled murrelet habitat is that that one egg or even that chick can be preyed upon. And so if that chick is easily accessed because there are lots of humans or lots of openings, lots of picnic tables and people leaving peanuts or things like that, then there's going to be more corvids naturally. We've all had a Steller's jay or a Canada jay come and visit us at a forested picnic table before. And they will also very willingly, if they find that one marbled murrelet egg, eat it. And then that's that one chance. So in ecology, we call that K-selected species of, they only raise one young. They don't even necessarily have a chick every single year. And there's a lot of investment at first in that one chick, but then that chick's just on its own at sea. So there's a lot of ecological natural history hurdles and obstacles for marbled murrelets to overcome in the first place just because of their lifestyle. And then we add habitat loss and their very specific need for old trees with lots of mosses, lichens, things growing on them that just take time. So here's another nice diagram by a science illustrator that just sort of illustrates the complexity of the diversity of habitats that this bird uses throughout its life cycle It has to go to the ocean to find fish, to eat, to feed that chick in the forest, right? That nest is usually midway up a really old tree with lots of horizontal branching and lots of things growing on it. So trees like that take time to grow. Fortunately, in coastal ranges, they don't take as much time as they would inland, but that's why birds like marbled murrelets exist in these areas. So scientists are working to try to continue to figure out if there is any kind of sustainable forestry that can happen in marbled murrelet habitat, or if it needs to just be completely off limits in order for these birds to thrive. So the next thing I want to talk about is birds that depend on abundant large dead trees. So we've talked about these other forest features of branching, of elevated mosses and lichens, of craggy bark, but large dead trees or snags are also a very important part of the ecosystem for the poster child of old growth forests, of course, the spotted owl, but also importantly, more in eastern Washington and in the state I live in, birds like great gray owls, and even Vox's swifts, which I saw was a featured topic for your next month's topic. So I'll have to tune into that because I really love those birds as well. So the spotted owl story, which you probably know better than I do, right, is that this bird is also extremely vulnerable. It's dependent on an old forest that is highly desirable for logging because big trees produce a lot of wood, at least historically, and habitat loss due to climate change and wildfires, but also especially because of barred owls beginning to colonize from the east to the western part of our continent. So this picture shows the historic range of the barred owl in blue, and then the current range of the barred owl in the hatched blue, so the stripy blue. So you can see that the barred owls lived very well in the eastern half of the United States in eastern forests. And there's some debate amongst ecologists and ornithologists as to the different theories of how and why these birds eventually moved west over through central Canada and then crept down into the Pacific Northwest and all the way down through the mountains and forests of California. So I'm not going to go into too many details on that, but these owls also need forests and they do need decent sized trees, but they are extremely more adaptable than the spotted owl, not nearly as vulnerable, a lot more resilient and able to change their ways of being. So the barred owl will breed every year. We'll have 2 to 4 chicks. The spotted owl might not breed every year, have 2 chicks, and is just way more susceptible to being ousted or killed by barred owls. So the Northwest Forest Plan is being updated, but it was evaluated a couple of years ago because it was the 25th anniversary. And I just wanted to highlight a few things about the outcomes and reflections on 25 years of the Northwest Forest Plan. One of those things over here on the left, you can see that the net change in late successional forest cover. So we could say mature forest, maybe starting to become old growth forest again, you know, putting an exact marker on that is difficult. It takes a long time, but we want all of these features to be present as well. So the change in outcome, either no change is all of the gray. Right? So that's the majority, which I guess is better than degraded, which is the red, and then improved, which is the blue. So that net change is, you know, a complicated, nuanced thing in general, but we had to break it down into 3. So we're not seeing vast improvements in the late successional forest cover. We're also not seeing vast degradation, but we're also not seeing vast replenishment, which is what the birds like the marbled murrelet needs. So over this study period from 2000 to, it looks like maybe 2020 was the last data point here, from the 25-year evaluation of the Northwest Forest Plan, you can see that the density and population of the marbled murrelets has continued to decline. So in addition to old growth habitat, this bird has specific needs, and not all of those are getting met. Some of those have to do with fish populations in the oceans, different currents and water temperatures in the oceans that affect their main food, these smaller fish. And then over here on the right, unfortunately, this one didn't come out so well, so I'll give you the gist of that. But the purple lines in all of these graphs are different regions, are the population trend of the spotted owl, the northern spotted owl, and the yellowish orange lines are the population trends of the barred owls in each of these study sites. So as you can see, spotted owl populations continue to decrease and barred owl populations continue to increase, which has resulted, as again I'm sure you know, in plans that allow for the killing and removing or culling of hundreds of thousands of barred owls to try to protect spotted owls from going extinct. An ethical dilemma that I'm not prepared to give you an answer to, but a very complicated situation with the spotted owls and the barred owls, and the dependence on a habitat type that they're not too flexible about using others. So one of the things that I found in my research that is really interesting about trying to survey for spotted owls is that they're pretty quiet birds. They will hoot. They sometimes respond to audio projections of their hooting, but barred owls are much more responsive. And so sometimes we wonder, are we actually getting an accurate picture when we survey for spotted owls? So there were some studies done that showed that hermit warblers, this one here, which I know, just extended on the western side of the state, but down through the spotted owl range, hermit warblers, their presence may be a good indicator of spotted owl habitat and where we could focus more efforts on trying to restore spotted owl populations. So I thought that was very fascinating. But this research study specifically shows the change in temperatures in the month of June or July. So the change over time based on breeding bird survey or BS routes. Some of you have probably been involved or still do those. I've done those before as well. So on these breeding bird survey routes, both species tended to decline in landscapes that had warmed. So over time, I can't remember how many years that they did this for, probably 10 to 20. Over time, if there was a change in the June or July maximum temperature, then these birds tended to decline even if the bird was spending time in second growth forest, like the Wilson's warbler, but would feed in nearby old growth forests as well. So that effect was dampened, which is rational, in landscapes with high proportions of old growth forests. So those population trends did not decrease where there were old growth forests, because old growth forests tend to stabilize climates and surface temperatures better than earlier successional forests. That doesn't mean we don't think that all successions of forest are necessary, all the stages, right? There are birds that really rely on those early successional forests, but some interesting research coming out about birds that aren't specifically linked to breeding in old forests impacted when there are old growth forests intact nearby because of the climate mitigating effects. And then I mentioned the Vox's swifts. So this picture is a bunch of swifts coming out of a chimney. I believe that was somewhere in Oregon. There's also such a thing as the chimney swift, but the Vox's swifts, they actually will use these hollowed out trees like this one I'm standing in. This is looking up into it. They will use those like they would use a chimney. And of course, this would be the original chimney. Where the Vox's swifts, they, with their saliva, a little bit like hummingbirds, use their saliva to help sort of glom on a little bracket nest, and they will nest colonially and roost colonially in these natural chimney structures. But they will also create nests inside of larger cavities that are formed by pileated woodpeckers, our larger woodpecker species. So these standing dead trees provide endless, I will say endless, because science has not discovered all of the benefits of standing dead trees, but endless benefits to birds, to insects, and all the ecological relationships. So let's shift to the old growth features of multiple stages of decomposition on the ground, which means that we need woody debris. So woody debris on the ground from eventually those large dead snags fall, right? Branches fall. There are branches that are slowly culled from these large old trees. And all of these different stages of decomposition provide immense amount of microhabitats and microclimates, not only for birds, but for insects, for fungi, for mosses, for lichens, for anything possible in the nooks and crannies of a moist forest floor. One of the elements of, I think, why we all love going to visit old forests so much, because it is kind of like a fairyland with all kinds of little nooks and crannies here. So the bird that I tend to spend the most time with when I am in old growth forests in northwestern Montana or in north central Idaho is the Pacific wren, previously known as the winter wren. And they very much love and are denizens of these lower woody debris of the old growth forests. So they love those nooks and crannies. They are definitely, their populations are correlated and do better in old forests. And they really prefer large stands of uncut forest. So not even just, tiny patch here or there, but that they do really well when they have larger uncut stands with lots of dead and downed wood. So here's a sweet little video of some Pacific wrens at a nest. One of those nests and crannies. There's a branch not far from the ground. And I could have watched those little baby winter wrens or Pacific wrens all day. One time I was hiking out of an old growth forest on Moscow Mountain, and I was with a friend who'd never been to an old growth forest, and we were walking out, and a few of some just barely flying fledgling Pacific wrens landed on his arm, and they were about the size of little bonbons, just little tiny donut holes. And he said, I feel like I was just baptized. So it was a pretty magical moment that I guess they decided to flush for something, and they landed right on him. So he'll never forget that. One more bird in this forest type, and I'm running out of time, so we'll keep going. But one more bird in this forest type is the red-breasted sapsucker. And I found an interesting study that was done on an island near Vancouver Island in BC. And basically, this table shows how many times, so on the lower part of the graph, on the x-axis, the number of times that a tree was used. And the black bar is for hemlock, and the white bar is for spruce. And then the number of trees. So, for example, 16 hemlock and 13 spruce were used 1 year over the course of this 1996 to 2015 study for red-breasted sapsuckers. Then, as you go down, you see that 6 times 4 trees were used 6 times for nesting. Okay, so a tree has to live for a really long time to support birds nesting in it 6 times or more. Here's a spruce that one spruce was used 10 different times in this time period. So even though these numbers don't necessarily talk about big trees, we know that they've got to be big, and we know that they've got to be old enough that they have enough structure to support a cavity nesting bird that builds a new cavity every single year, right? And that they keep coming back to some of these same trees as many as 10 times, some of them 8 times, right? Lots of them 1 time. But then these hemlocks here, there were 10 hemlocks that were used at least 3 times over this study. So birds are continually honing in on these features of old growth forests, and when they find just the right tree with just the right amount of decomposition going on, just the right amount of substrate for nesting, then they'll keep using it. And when we disturb forests or when we log them on 40-year rotations, that possibility just gets taken away. So even though red-breasted sapsuckers are a little bit more flexible in their habitat needs, when they can use a reliable old tree, they will. And this final graph, basically I'll just draw your attention to these black squares. And this was basically saying that it increases on both axes the arthropod species in canopy stem and forest floor zones increase in old growth forests compared to uneven aged or even aged forests. So we've got all of our birds that love this arthropod diversity, right? Insects, spiders, centipedes, millipedes, all kinds of things. So they will reach peak abundances because of these features that we've been talking about. Old trees, furrowed, thick bark, lots of woody debris, lots of deep litter on the ground, and stable and more moderate temperatures and humidities. I will skip this one for now for the sake of time, just except to say that the complexity goes on, that there are microbiomes within a single tree, just like we know that we have microbiomes in our guts, and that, of course, as you can imagine, they get more complex and diverse in older forests. So let's shift gears a little bit to the dry forest, old growth forest features. This is an old growth ponderosa pine forest in the eastern part of the state. And we'll look at, again, some of these features with dead trees, some similar players, cavity nesters, the white-headed woodpecker, and one of my favorites, the little pygmy nuthatch, right, that are very associated with larger diameter ponderosa pine trees and forests. So we originally thought that the white-headed woodpecker was old growth forest dependent. They seem to be adapting, but we're also learning a lot more about their needs and about the role of fire and the consequences of suppressing fire and then trying to mimic fire or not. So this is just, I'll just show a quick snippet of this white-headed woodpecker. This little jaunty tune. Goes goes along with the video. One of my ornithology professors studied them. She called them flying ice cream cones, vanilla scallop on the top of a dark colored cone. So what we've learned about what we've learned about white-headed woodpeckers is that, like I said, they're not quite as dependent on old growth per se, is that they do not do well in the planting of even age stands with no standing dead wood. Well, duh, right? Those snags, as we know, are really important. And they don't do well when there's too much fire suppression. So when we took away that role of the fire cycle in these drier western forests, which could be as frequent as every 5 to 10 years, low intensity fires that are clearing out those smaller trees, clearing out some of those lower dried branches, and favoring larger trees, but also leaving trees that either died in the fire to stay standing and slowly decompose and be used by these cavity nesters, or just to create a little bit more structural diversity instead of an even age stand where no fire comes through. So the research says, if you want white-headed woodpeckers, don't remove the snags. Try not to suppress fire, or at least try to mimic it or use prescribed burning. And definitely try to avoid a forest being just an even age stand, right? So mixed age, mixed diversity feature the old growth forests. So we could say, maybe they are associated with old growth forests, but what they're really associated with are the features that are present within an old forest when left to its own devices. Fire is a huge issue out west, and I know that it's complicated, but these birds evolved with it. And so when their populations are in question, then we have to think about what role fire might have played in their ecologies before. Another species that likes these large cavities and depends upon the cavities of the primary nesters, like the white-headed woodpecker, are the little flammulated owls. And these little owls aren't nearly as in trouble as the spotted owls, but we don't know a lot about them. They're quite secretive, they're quite elusive. They might also be victims to barred owl expansion. Owls tend to be pretty territorial, and barred owls tend to kind of be the bully on the block and tend to push everyone else away. But when there are stands of structurally diverse old, dry, ponderosa pine and other dry forests, that's higher predictability of finding these sweet little flammulated owls. So with that, I just want to speak a little bit about the Old Growth Forest Network and what we do. We are trying to create a national network of protected old growth forests, at least one per forested county across the country. We started in the Northeast, where there was hardly any old growth forest left. The terrain was so easily logged and cleared for things like sheep grazing and other such things. And so our model was formed in the Northeast, and it's slowly expanding west. And my job is to try to sort of interpret and translate this model to a part of the country where we are blessed enough to have a lot more public land than they do in the Northeast. We have lots more tracts of forests, even if they have been disturbed, but that are managed under one umbrella, which has its pros and cons. And so my job is to try to identify at least one out west, and we rely on a lot of volunteer options to say, hey, do you know this place or this forest? This is a special place, and this should be part of the old growth forest network. So not only does this network create sort of a registry on our website, but eventually the long-term goal is to have some kind of common repository of data and information about old growth and mature second growth forests that are being managed to become the future old growth for research and for public enjoyment and appreciation. Oh, well, I'm glad that only happened at the very end. I think that was supposed to be my contact information, but Sammy had that before. Huh, interesting. So I poached and copied a lot of images and tried to give credit where credit was due, but the only ones that aren't actually showing up in my presentation are the ones from my organization itself. So I guess we have a lot of blocks on that. So with that, that's a lot of talking on my part and not getting to see you all. I am going to
I know it's such a shame, but what you can't see is all of us with smiles and applauding loudly.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the share so I can see you all.
Ashley, would you like me to put your email address in the chat?
Yeah. All right, here, I'm going to gallery view so I can see you all. Not speaker.
See, people are making those little things go on. Excellent.
All right, well, it's only showing me and the dark Sammy, but thank you for, yes, the claps and the, and the thumbs up. I appreciate that. I do love to see you all.
Yay.
So any questions?
We have one written question asking if pileated woodpeckers are more prone to like old growth forests. The person, Monique, says we see them in second growth around eastern Washington and northern Idaho with some.
Yep. Yeah, so that's kind of the same story. I'm just seeing, Elaine, your
Yeah, I'm in process. I'm horrible at doing two things at once, so give me 1 second.
That's okay. So pileated woodpeckers are similar story to the story that I told about white-headed woodpeckers, right? We know that they need large diameter trees because they're a big woodpecker, right? And in order to excavate a cavity that's big enough to then hold a clutch of 4-ish baby pileated woodpeckers, it's got to be a big enough tree that has enough wood that has the right amount of decomposition in order for them to excavate the cavity, but not so much that it's being decomposed by ants and things that, of course, woodpecker families do not want around their babies. And so that larger diameter tree is definitely a case. And then, as I mentioned, the Voxus swifts, for example, right, the flammulated owls, for example, right, are also other birds that then depend on those primary cavity nesters because they don't excavate their own, but they need to use those cavities that are formed by those primary cavity nesters. And the pileated woodpecker is the one equipped to make the biggest cavities. So I think that pileated woodpeckers would be very happy to have more old growth forest accessible, but I'm also very grateful that they are a little more adaptable, especially more adaptable than the ivory-billed woodpecker. So I have a lot of gratitude for resilience in birds while we humans try to figure out what the heck we're doing.
And I have to tell a little vignette on Ashley. When we had our rehearsal the other night, she owned up to being a avid birder in her childhood. And what did you say? My great ambition was to rewrite the birder's handbook.
Oh, yeah.
That was great.
Yeah.
Let me ask one. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what Birds of the World is for. They rewrote it online.
Boy, howdy. It really makes you appreciate the time and work and all that happened when you couldn't revise it, right?
Yeah. Oh my
Um,
God.
Let me draw our attention to this map that the Old Growth Forest Network provides on their website. Green states have network forests. Network forests, see if I've done my homework right here. These are the ones that have at least 20 acres. This is the bottom of the slide here. They're open to the public and no logging is allowed. Those have been
So,
designated by your network. And could you give us some examples of what differences that designation has made
mm,
for management and so on?
yeah, so it depends on the part of the country that you're in, but in some cases, in the Northeast, especially with larger, or I'm sorry, smaller parcels of land and lots of diverse land ownership. Um, our organization has helped elevate protections in different municipalities. So whether it's a township, a county, a city forest property, that they have, been able to provide rationale for why that forest should be managed to become future old growth. It's easier to work with the smaller entities in the Northeast than it is out west, where I'm working with much larger entities. However, every time that we have a forest dedication out west, we bring more attention and education to what an old growth forest is and all the ways that old growth forests can express themselves, all the features that are important for biodiversity. So there is a forest, for example, I'm coming out to Western Washington on Saturday of this week to go looking at colleges with my daughter, but I'm also going to visit Point Defiance Park, which is part of Tacoma Parks. And there is a core of old growth forest at the far end of that peninsula, which some of you may know about. And I'm working with a volunteer out there who's one of the volunteers for Point Defiance, who is concerned about how some of the forest is being managed, just kind of loved to death. And so we're working to try to bring more awareness to the importance of the old growth forest features there and bring that forest into what's called our community forest program, which is forests that are closer to urban areas and more of a part of a community. And so hopefully with that, we can influence how that forest is treated better, not only for the trees, but for all the species that depend upon it, while still allowing people to appreciate it. So that's just an example out west. We also work with private forests, private landowners, and those are also really fascinating stories of helping educate people about the importance of old growth and the features. Some people will protect just a portion of their land, some all of their land, managing it for future old growth if it's been logged before, or protecting the unlogged portions. So it sort of runs the whole gamut from wilderness areas to scenic areas to city parks to research natural areas, which is a federal designation, BLM land if we're talking about juniper, old growth pinyon juniper forests in the southwest. So there's a lot of different ways that a forest can become part of the old growth forest network. But in the end, all of them are about celebrating the forest and the people who helped make sure that it exists the way that it does. So we do try to bring a lot of honor and attention to the conservationists and activists that were involved over time in making sure that these old forests remained old forests until their natural death.
Very good. I'm sorry if I'm making you all seasick changing slides. One of my slides has gone walkabout, but it showed that in Washington State we have 9, I believe, old growth forests. We have, one of the goals I read of the Old Growth Forest Network is to have an old growth forest in every county, which is perhaps a little ambitious, but we have 39 counties. We got a long ways to go here, and we have some of the richest habitat.
Yep.
I was surprised that a couple of the ones that are here in Seattle, we'll have to look into that. And by the way, I'll paste in a minute. You can nominate a place to be examined, evaluated by the Old Growth Forest Network. But that's in a minute here. One of our wonderful viewers, John Houghton, has asked, there was a picture of a marbled murrelet on the nest limb in winter plumage. Is that common? Or was it early in the season? Or are juvenile, or is that juvenile plumage as it leaves for winter at sea? Not
Oh, that's a great question. I will have to pull that up again and see if I can do that. Let's go back to that. We'll look at it a little bit closer together.
John, feel free to unmute so you can comment.
I got to the marble murrelet section, and then I lost my cursor. Oh, there we go. All right, there we go. See if I can move myself out of the way. There, yeah, I mean, it's more mottled, so that could be the chick about to fledge, but it doesn't look brown enough. So yeah, it does look like a winter plumage adult. What do you think?
Sure does. But I'm not the right person to answer.
I mean, I also thought that at first when I looked at this, that this looked like snow around the rim. And then I realized that that there wasn't really snow anywhere else, and so that this was either light or some other kind of material. I don't think it's droppings, but yeah, maybe this was a practice run. I don't have an answer to that.
Any other questions, anyone? Feel free to, if you wish, unmute if you're not into typing.
Well, I just found out today that there was going to be a Zoom presentation about forests by the Washington Park Arboretum. I think it's next week, but I can't remember what they said. So it's going to be on their website.
Great. You all have a really great opportunity in Washington with a really active conservation contingency, with the Legacy Forest program. We're starting to try to form partnerships with them. And that is a lot of the state-owned lands in the state of Washington. And there's a lot of effort and movement in that regard. We, as an organization, we don't litigate. And so we are limited in terms of that kind of work. We do more education, appreciation, and sort of reinforcement of good decisions that have been made. And if we can help those good decisions be made without using the law as a tool, then we definitely will. But we're a lot softer in our approach than some of the Forest Watch organizations, which use litigation as a strong tool, which is absolutely necessary and essential. It's just not our approach.
I have a footnote to offer from Chaz and Alan Grennan, who mentioned that Birds of the World and other resources show that juveniles do have plumage resembling winter plumage.
All right. Yeah.
And
so maybe that's
and
one about to fly.
Great. And we have a question on the Old Growth Forest Network. Does it support, quote, old growth, unquote, sage steppe habitat also? Or is the focus on lands with actual trees? We have beautiful sage habitat here in Washington with specific birds in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have sagebrush meadow up above my house here in amazing birds. So we have to draw the line somewhere, but we have definitely entertained like Joshua tree forests, which aren't really trees. So I guess we could get to that point. But we just, yeah, we have to have a niche area, but I definitely am with you. And sagebrush is a really important ecosystem as well. I mean, they're all important in their own way. And we've just chosen old growth forests as our specific focus area. And we've chosen that hugely because of the way when I introduced this talk and had you sort of imagine yourself in that forest, that there is a real sense of awe and wonder, a sense of feeling really tiny and insignificant, but also transcendent and interconnected to everything when you're in the presence of a really old forest. And if you've been to one, I'm sure you know exactly what I mean when you say that there is this just real, almost spiritual element to being in an old forest that I don't always feel when I'm in a sagebrush steppe habitat, but I might feel awe and excited about birds. But I think a lot of people feel that sense of wonder in old growth forests, and that's one of the things that we also really value, and why our founder chose old growth forests as her sort of mission habitat.
Excellent.
Thank you, Ashley. It was a wonderful presentation, and I know when I go hiking, I will be much more educated about looking around for all these grooved bark and the branches and the decomposing forest. Really appreciate your time, and especially since you're on a different time zone than us, and I hope that Old Growth Network continues to thrive, and thank you for your time with us tonight.
Yes, please. Thanks for attending, and please reach out if you have any forests to nominate or just have any questions. It's easy to reach us on our website, oldgrowthforest.net. Thank you.